we celebrated President's Day on Monday, and we're going to talk about a president and Ben Franklin. Joining us today, Father David Ross. He is the Director of Community Engagement at LCC, and he wants to talk about the book Franklin and Washington by Edward Larson. And thanks for joining us today, Father.
Thank you. It's great being with you, Holly.
Okay, so this book talks about George Washington and Ben Franklin, huh?
Yeah, the 30-year relationship. I found it fascinating because oftentimes when I read historical books, you don't get into the character. And we find these polar opposites in a sense. Franklin, for example, was in favor of abolition. And Washington was in favor of keeping slavery. And they argued quite a bit back and forth about this. But the thing that united them, of course, was the fact that the states were being taxed, not the states, but the colonies were being taxed by the British government, by the king, without any kind of representation. And it just infuriated people because acts were being enacted, so to speak, that curbed their freedoms. But what really made it interesting to me was looking at the characters of the persons. Let me show you something. Some time ago, I don't know if you can see this, somebody gave me this wonderful copy of a newspaper that came from Philadelphia. It was printed in 1830. I don't know if you can see the date down here. Anyway, somewhere 1830. My fingers keep moving around.
But
it was printed 31 years after George Washington died. And what I find fascinating about it is this newspaper, for the most part, had to do with matters religious, moral obligations of people and things of that nature. And usually in that time period, when Washington and Franklin were around, that was not of great interest because it was a period of the Enlightenment, the late Enlightenment. And consequently, people were not so much interested in that. But we find Washington and we find Franklin, in a sense, having some connection because of their moral sense that led them to fight for the nation. It's just a fascinating book. Sometimes you have to page through it and use the Evelyn Wood method because the author goes into so many intricate details. But I just find it good to see a different side of Washington, the humble man, yet the person who would take his troops if they were treasonous and shoot them. And of course, Franklin, who was in Paris at the time, who was in France, who just wooed all the people in France. They loved him so much, they made him a national hero in France. But he was one who would be the consummate diplomat, the consummate person who would be careful about every word he said, as we noticed.
Well, I think it's kind of neat to refreshing to look back and see how, even though they had differences in politics back then, they got along. They thought about country, and maybe we need a little bit more of that today.
Well, what I find interesting is this. In this book, now interesting is a non-committal word, but what I find is that even though they had great differences, they found the opportunities to compromise and to get along, which is something that we have so much difficulty with today. In our government. And even though, for example, they disagreed about the whole issue of slavery, they were able to work things out so much so that they thought the nation was the most important thing, keeping the nation unified, as they did at the Constitutional Convention, keeping the nation as one, because they realized there were many forces outside the nation. Britain, for example, a second time when after the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, then Britain the second time was so much concerned about what's the word I want to use? Capturing our nation again. And Franklin and Washington were totally against this.
Yeah,
and that's what brought them together. It cemented a friendship. And it was more than on a political level too. They would dine together. They would write each other letters, which were almost intimate at times, when they spoke about the esteem that each held for the other. I would recommend the book. It's a good book. It's an easy read. It's a very easy read.
Sounds like a good one. Franklin and Washington. Thank you very much, Father Ross, for joining us.
Thanks, Holly. Have a good day.
All right. Don't go away. Noon Edition continues in a moment.